It isn't paranoia if it's real. Jason mumbled to himself, repeating that sentence for the 100th time probably, while hammering another nail into the frame. The sun was still up, but sinking already. He should easily be done with it all before night fell. Perfect. Still, even though he felt good about the work, what he didn't feel great about was what he knew would happen. He had seen it, hadn't been able to shake it for months now. Jason groaned and let his forehead touch the rough but sturdy wood. It all had started almost half a year ago, with a simple dream. A world in smoke and shadows. People trying to flee from what looked like an avalanche of black dust racing through the streets of a city. At first, he had thought those were simply bad dreams. Nightmares brought forth by stress. But they returned. At first, sporadically. Maybe once every 2 weeks. But slowly, they started to invade his sleep, night after night. He had seen places he knew covered in this strange smoke that seemed to be moving on its own. Faces of people he recognized, dead on the ground. His own home, which stood abandoned and empty. And around 2 months ago, he had even gotten a date and time. 1st of January, just after midnight. The new year would start off by eradicating them all. Of course, he had tried to warn people, but had realized soon enough that those close to him didn't want to be bothered like that. He could absolutely understand how they felt. If those nightmares hadn't been this vivid, if he hadn't felt their pull, he would probably have been the same. Still, he felt responsible for not being able to convince them. If he had tried it differently, could he have saved them? At least one of them? Probably not. Jason screamed out and felt his hot breath in the cold air. No. This was not the time to feel guilty. His nightmares would be coming true in a little bit under 6 hours. What he needed to do right now was fortify this hut out in the woods, then go inside, lock the door, and hope that it would be enough. He had rented it for a couple of bucks, which felt kinda icky, since the owner would never again come out here, had left his car behind at the edge of this forest, and had trekked up here on his own. 6 times in the last few days. He had enough supplies to get through a couple of weeks and had carried some of the boards he had used to fortify the windows up here as well. But no roads meant less impact tonight. The smoke should blow over the forest and leave it almost intact. At least, that was what Jason counted on. He wasn't 100% sure, but close enough. The most important thing would be to bury all his electronics at least a mile away before the night hit. Which he had done already. Well, most of it. He still had his phone in his pocket. 2 missed calls and 1 email. His friends had tried contacting him to invite him to a party, but Jason had declined. And the email was from work. He got fired for being a no-show. Jason laughed again as he thought about it. By tomorrow, the office wouldn't be there anymore, as would the people. Well, maybe some of them would survive? No, He shouldn't give in to such hopes, Jason warned himself again. What would happen, would happen. All he could do now was concentrate on his own survival and hope that some people would manage to do so as well. His dreams had never told him how wide the area of destruction would be. So maybe this here would be the only place where it happened. Jason doubted it. In his dreams, he had seen the destruction far and wide. It couldn't just be localized to here. Whatever the case, he would need to try and survive. He could take care of everything else afterward. Jason hammered in another nail and looked along the side of the hut. None of the windows were visible anymore. It should withstand the smoke-like stuff, right? He walked around the whole hut once more, checked on every strut and board and hammered in a few more nails before finally, with a sigh and a bad feeling in his stomach, he put the tool back into his belt. Maybe one more hour before it would get dark. Jason tapped his pocket to make sure the phone was still in there, then opened the door to the hut and looked at his belongings, dropped right by the entrance where he could still see. He had brought a candle to measure time with. Each of the dark markings in the white wax showed another hour. He checked one last time with his phone, wrote the number on the back of his hand, and ignited the candle. 5.5 markings would pass before it began. He pulled the hunting knife from his belt and made a slight notch into the wax to approximately mark midnight on it. This was all he could do, all he dared to keep. Jason looked through the bags to make sure he hadn't overlooked anything with a power source, then turned and locked the hut before setting off. He could feel the tension in the air. Nothing was moving inside the forest. No birds, no small animals. It was the same as in the city. Even the pigeons had flown off a few days ago. That had been his sign that his dreams would come true. The final proof needed for him to throw everything else away. He had said his farewells to his friends, even though they hadn't realized that it had been a goodbye, and had left. And now he was here, tracking through the woods again with only a thin sheet of snow covering the mossy forest floor all around him. He still had a bit of time, Jason told himself. Enough to send out a text. Should he do it? No. His friends didn't know about the hut, and telling them how to get here would only result in them getting mad at him again. He probably wouldn't even be able to give them accurate enough directions anyway, not with darkness soon setting in. This was the lot of all those with prophetic abilities in the legends and myths of old. Like Cassandra, seeing the inevitable danger, yet not being able to get another person to believe. Jason closed his eyes and continued his way up between the trees. He felt tired and exhausted. Not just the hard work of fortifying the hut now weighed him down, but also the sadness he could feel swelling in his chest. All the people he knew would perish in under 6 hours' time. And there was nothing he could do about it. It was torturous. Yet, he still kept walking while pushing all those emotions down and away from him. Now wasn't the time for mourning. Jason told himself over and over again, and only stopped once he found himself in a small clearing where he had dug a shallow hole in the frozen forest floor. He could see the metal box in there glimmering in the light, and suddenly felt completely overwhelmed. Jason's legs buckled as he had to close his eyes again and calm his breathing. What was he doing here? Why even bother to survive? Those were the questions tormenting him the most. This metal box in a shallow hole was something like a coffin for his life. He would bury it. Everything. All the things that had kept him tethered to this world. His family, his friends, they would all die here. If he was honest to himself for a moment, he hadn't even really tried to save them. Yeah, some of them might have actually turned away from him if he had continued pestering them. But just maybe one or two might have believed him. But it was too late for that now. There was no do-over. No way of saving them now. He cried and groaned and screamed, but nothing and no one answered him. There weren't even animals around to hear his shouts. He was completely alone, and that wouldn't change for the foreseeable future. With a last echoing scream, he let out all the pain and agony as his fist hammered against the cold and frozen dirt he was kneeling on, before he lifted his head and looked up into the clear evening sky. The sun would be setting soon. There were no clouds in sight. Everything looked calm and serene, as if nothing was wrong. Jason could feel himself shaking. If there was a God, he was looking down on him right then and there, he felt, watching him without even a single shred of mercy. This was just too cruel. But Jason knew that he shouldn't waste any more time. Even though it would be hours before the catastrophe occurred, he didn't want to be out in the woods getting lost in the night. God or no God, he would survive and find a way to stay alive. He pulled out his phone and looked at its screen one last time before shutting it off and putting it into the metal box. With slow, methodical movements, he started covering it up, now truly feeling like he was looking down at a tiny coffin, and tried to clear his head once again. Jason resisted the urge to somehow recite the prayer, just stood up and stomped on the soft earth until he was satisfied. It was time for him to go back. With a last longing sigh, he turned away and began walking. The eerie silence surrounding him seemed to play tricks on his nerves. From time to time, Jason felt like someone was watching him, whispering somewhere behind his back. No one was there, and the only sound you could hear was the almost inaudible noise the low wind made while brushing past the naked and dead trees. He could feel the coldness slowly seeping in beneath his clothing. The tips of his fingers were already stinging, and the skin on his wrists felt numb. If he stayed out here much longer, he would probably catch a cold, he warned himself. And that was something he really didn't need right now. Depending on how bad the situation got, getting sick might actually put him in danger. If the area of destruction was big enough, it might be months before anyone would find him. Or maybe it would be never. If the whole globe got covered by what he had seen in his dreams, he might actually become one of a handful of people still alive. Jason shook his head to push the thoughts out of his mind. No, that wasn't something he should think about right now, anyway. He sped up and slid down a patch of frozen moss before catching himself on the trunk of one of the dead-looking trees. For some reason, he was far more exhausted than on the way up. His heart was racing, and the small clouds his breath formed in the cold air seemed to grow thicker with every second. It was just the nerves, he told himself. Nothing more than the stress and tension he felt fucking with his stamina. The sun was getting really low already, and he knew that soon the first fireworks would shoot up into the sky. He really didn't want to see that. There wasn't a single joyous thought or emotion in him right now. All the people down there would be ringing in with the end of their own life. The end of the city. Or maybe the whole area. And they didn't even know. Jason pushed himself off the tree trunk and started jogging. He wanted to be out of here before the sun completely disappeared. To hide in his hut when the first fireworks ascended toward the sky. It would be far better for him to simply not see it. To spend his time doing anything else besides watching the early start of the celebration. And to be as far away from the screams that would follow as possible. Out of breath and with a racing heartbeat, Jason ran through the dead, silent forest. The hut was close, would be up ahead soon. He felt like he was racing against time already. With a jump, he cleared a fallen tree and then started to run along a tiny trail left by the creatures normally living here. The sun was sinking down. It was already touching the horizon. He groaned as his hand hit old bark, but didn't slow down. If the world was to end, he didn't want to see it. Jason climbed up a slight slope and slid down on the other side as his eyes fell upon the hut once more. The light of the disappearing sun was hardly touching it. It looked different like that. Far less friendly. Still, he didn't hesitate, ran down and unlocked the door with his numb and shaking fingers. Just a few hours more, he told himself. Warm air brushed past him as he opened the entrance, then stepped inside and closed the door behind him. He could see the candle still burning and was about to reach the first marking. Jason looked at the back of his hand and the black numbers he had written on his now red and shaking skin. A few hours still to go. He finally pulled off the jacket and other layers of clothing before dressing in something less cold and dry. In the flickering light of the candle, the small and cramped hut looked like it could have come out of one of those frontier living prospects. There was an oil lamp hanging beside the door, a single cot, old and used, and the workbench the owner must have made himself, since there was hardly any right angle in the thing. It was abysmal by modern standards, but for tonight, it should be enough. He didn't bother lighting the lamp and instead carried the candle over to the workbench before plopping down on the cot and burying his face in his hands. Would it even work? Would the small hut withstand what was coming? Well, if not, he wouldn't have much time to regret his decisions. Jason tried to lift his spirits, but failed miserably. Well, it wasn't like he could change anything anyway. Running back to the car and driving into the city was out of the question. He probably would get lost and freeze, and even if he managed to reach his vehicle, the traffic would stop him anyway. All he could do was sit here and wait. Jason cursed. Maybe he should start reading the books he had bought on survival. He looked up for a moment and couldn't even really see the bag on the other side of the room. There was no chance he would be able to see the words on a page. No. All he could do right now was wait. With a groan, he lifted his feet off the ground and stretched his body out on the cot. The flickering light of the candle on the workbench danced in front of his eyes as he did so. He felt exhausted and sad. Now, he didn't even have his phone with him to call someone or waste some time. Jason closed his eyes. Well, he thought to himself, it wasn't like he would miss something if he rested for a bit. There still were hours to go, and now he couldn't change anything anymore anyway. Depending on how the night went, he wouldn't get another wink of sleep anytime soon. Jason turned to his side and tried to calm his breathing. His heartbeat was still far too fast. He could feel the tension in his whole body. But slowly, he could feel his mind drifting off. First, back to his friends and family. At least it would be quick for them. Then, to his workplace. That one, he wouldn't miss as much. Then, to the box, about a mile away. He could see the metal glowing through the trampled down earth, while the moon was shining high above. All around the clearing, the shadows were starting to move. Clouds, high above, began covering up the only source of light, plunging the world into a darkness that seemed never-ending. Jason could feel himself kneeling on the ground beside the box, unable to move a single muscle. Lightning was shooting through the darkness. Purple, not pure white, and completely silent. The wind picked up. He could hear it, rushing through the trees and breaking off branches, and feel it, its coldness stinging the skin of his hands and face like needles. The light of the box flickered and dimmed, before suddenly Jason felt this strange surge. It was like the air was getting sucked up, like the wind was now blowing from beneath, and all the purple flashes disappeared. He couldn't even move, couldn't even think straight. It felt like a giant being was hovering above him, taller than any skyscraper, sucking in air and holding its breath. Something bad was about to happen, but there was nothing he could do. No human could. He wanted to close his eyes and turn away, but neither of those things seemed possible. The giant suddenly roared as a single massive lightning strike hit the earth in front of Jason, right where the box was buried, and obliterated the ground. The noise was deafening, the heat unendurable, and the force that pushed out from the strike zone seemed to shatter him in a million tiny pieces. But he didn't wake up. Jason felt himself floating, hovering in the air. He could see the city now. Fireworks were going up into the air. People were celebrating the incoming new year. He could almost feel the electricity, the joy and love of life. They were happy, looking forward to the giant party. Yet even through it all, he could also feel something else. A strange wind started up. The light flashes of the fireworks were illuminating the clouds that seemed to slowly move in. Far lower than they should be. The bright light was hitting dark, mist-like smoke, and none of them seemed to realize what was about to happen. Jason didn't try to scream or warn them. He knew it would be pointless. They couldn't be helped. It was already beginning. He could see the edges of the city slowly getting covered as more and more dark smoke rolled in, like endless waves of an ocean in the sky. It was coming from all sides. The music kept blaring, but the voices seemed to quiet now. People were seeing it. Now, finally feeling that something was wrong. One single loud scream echoed out from one of the skyscrapers in the center of the city, as suddenly the fireworks illuminated the smoke that seemed to move on its own. A single pillar, like a tentacle, was coming down from the sky and reached in between the buildings. Smoke was racing through the streets like an avalanche, and that one scream turned into many. Uncountable voices rang out in fear and pain, then fell silent, one by one. He watched in horror as the beings swallowed the city, block by block. Skyscrapers were invaded from the bottom as the black stuff raced up the buildings and spewed out of the top. No more fireworks were going up, as down below fires broke out. The silence was almost deafening, while this black mass filled the whole area and purple flashes shot through the now dead city. Jason jumped up from his cot, drenched in sweat and shivering in the cold air. The light of the candle was flickering, and as he looked over, he could see that the last marking above the notch was already melting. 30 minutes. Then it would start. He wiped his forehead and looked around. His heart was beating almost out of control. He was still sweating, shivering, and feeling sick to his stomach. Jason walked over to his belongings, pulled out another coat, and put it on. He still felt shaky on his legs, even though he had seen that dream what felt like 100 times before. It always left him in this completely broken state. The shivering would stop in a few minutes, since it wasn't purely from the cold, but this dread would only increase from now on. Not even 30 minutes, he warned himself. Part of him was still looking for a way to stop it. Maybe he could warn people, try it one last time. No. It had been impossible weeks ago and was completely unthinkable now. Even if he could somehow scream at the city, and they would all believe him, there was no way they could evacuate in such a short time. He walked over to the door and locked it again, before picking up a board, his hammer, and a few nails, and started fortifying the entrance. Jason thought he could hear fireworks far away. It was hardly noticeable, but he was sure. Small rockets would be ascending toward the sky right now, illuminating the clear and empty air above the city. The people there should at least enjoy their last moments, he thought, and felt a pit in his stomach. Wouldn't it be easier to join them? A part of him asked. He wouldn't have to go on alone. What did he think he could do on his own? If everyone else disappeared, all that would be waiting for him was a life in absolute isolation. He would lose his mind sooner or later. In the city, with his friends, he could find peace. Yes, he would die, but at least he would do so in the company of the people he loved. Jason felt the hammer slipping from his grasp and heard it clunking on the ground. Yeah. he didn't want to be alone. Yet still, he had worked those past few weeks on his way to survive. Others would do the same. Maybe there were more people with those strange dreams. They could find each other, help each other rebuild. He looked over his shoulder and could see the light of the candle dancing as if a wind was blowing through the hut. But there was nothing. Jason felt his heartbeat up in his head. His legs were buckling. It was starting. Some part of him had still clung to the possibility that all of this was just his imagination. That he had gone insane. That nothing would happen, and he would be able to return to civilization tomorrow. Without a job, yeah, but still able to continue living like he had before. He could hear the wind picking up outside as he knelt there in front of the flickering flame of the single candle in the small and cramped hut. It really was coming. His nightmares were about to invade reality. Jason felt his whole body shaking. He thought he could still hear fireworks far away, but wasn't sure anymore with the rushing of the wind. The whole hut around him started creaking. The boards across the windows were aching, and he could even hear the nails moving and shifting inside the wood. Would the hut hold out? He had asked himself that very question again and again those past few days, but had never gotten an answer. What if it didn't? Well, there was less doubt about that. He fell to the floor and started crawling toward the cot. It wouldn't protect him, he knew, but at least he wouldn't be able to see what was about to happen. One of the shingles on the roof broke and got ripped away. Jason was praying. If it should happen, he wanted it to be quick. He rolled beneath the cot just as the wind suddenly stopped. The silence setting in felt as loud as the storm. All he could hear was his own breathing, his racing heartbeat, and the noise his shaking fingers made against the rough wooden planks of the floor. But he could feel it now. It was the same sensation that had followed him through his nightmares. This overwhelming presence was moving in. Like the pressure of the air had been increased. Jason could hardly breathe anymore as he cowered beneath the cot, when suddenly he heard the air outside moving. But not in the way the wind would. No. It was getting sucked away, pulling loose branches and nails off the ground around the hut and dragging them into the air. Jason held his breath as well. It was like in one of his dreams. He knew what would come next. An earth-shattering boom filled the air and shook the forest, and the hut, as what felt like an earthquake, raced through the ground. Jason screamed. He couldn't even hear himself. Above him, windows shattered and boards got ripped out together with the nails. The candle went dark, but he could still hear the shards of glass landing everywhere on the floor around him. A purple flash of light made the tiny fragments glimmer, and even though he wanted to close his eyes, Jason couldn't look away. The world was ending, his instincts told him. Whatever had come was destroying it. He almost screamed as a hissing noise filled the air, and something broke the pieces of the window right above his cot. A purple, glowing flash of light filled the interior, and in the hundreds of reflections, Jason could see the dark smoke pushing in like a tendril. He had seen what would happen if it touched him in his dreams. The pain and desperate expressions of those swallowed up by the smoke had never left him. Jason silently pushed his back against the wall, while the light disappeared again and left him in complete darkness. The smoke would be moving around, extending its feelers, looking for victims. His hand was clasped in front of his mouth. He could feel it. It was still inside the hut with him, even though he couldn't see anything anymore. But he could smell it. It was stinging in his nose, followed by the stench of rotten eggs. Sulfur. Jason clasped the other hand over his nose. He could feel his lungs already burning from getting too little air, but the stench would otherwise make him retch. And he had to avoid getting this thing's attention. Something touched a cot above his head, and Jason heard the cloth sizzling. The problem was that he felt no kind of heat emanating from the smoke. Everything it touched seemed to burn, but it wasn't a natural fire. Jason saw another flash of light, this time only partly blocked by the tendril, and almost screamed into his hands. The smoke had made its way down to the floor and was crawling in through the broken apart window. It was so close to him that he could feel the electricity in the air, and now saw dim, tiny lightning arcs dancing through the ethereal mass. The thing would get him, touch him and burn him alive. He wasn't safe either. Jason watched a spark flying up from the rough wooden floor and felt it landing on his cheek. His heart was racing completely out of control. He couldn't breathe, didn't have enough air in his lungs. Another lightning flash illuminated the interior of the hut. Smoke was everywhere. Darkness was pressing in on him. He could smell the sulfur now through his hands. Jason whimpered, and suddenly the world turned black. He awoke with a scream while feeling almost completely numb. Only this time, he couldn't remember his nightmares. Jason looked around, his vision still hazy, and crawled out from beneath the cot. Shards of glass were lying everywhere. The candle had melted into the workbench. He could still smell sulfur in the air. Jason staggered and stumbled, then pulled himself up. Somehow, he had survived. But it brought him no relief. He looked over his shoulder and out of the demolished window. Where the trees and woods had been was now a single, burned and barren wasteland. He could feel hot tears on his almost frozen skin. The whole area had been cut down and turned to ashes. He could see out into the world. There was the city, so far away, jutting out of a sea of ashes. Jason knew what he was seeing. There was no life there either, because all he could see from the skyscrapers, once brimming with people, was now a single trail of smoke, reaching up to the clear and indifferent sky.